The Coward, a short story by Guy de Maupassant. In society, he was called Handsome Signol. His name was Vicomte Gontran Joseph de Signol. An orphan and possessed of an ample fortune, he cut quite a dash, as it is called. He had an attractive appearance and manner, could talk well, had a certain inborn elegance, an air of pride and nobility, a good moustache and a tender eye that always finds favour with women. He was in great request at receptions, waltzed to perfection, and was regarded by his own sex with that smiling hostility accorded to the popular society man. He had been suspected of more than one love affair, calculated to enhance the reputation of a bachelor. He lived a happy, peaceful life, a life of physical and mental well-being. He had won considerable fame as a swordsman and still more as a marksman. "When the time comes for me to fight a duel," he said, "I shall choose pistols. With such a weapon, I am sure to kill my man." One evening, having accompanied two women friends of his with their husbands to the theatre, he invited them to take some ice cream at Tortoni's after the performance. They had been seated a few minutes in the restaurant when Signoles noticed that a man was staring persistently at one of the ladies. She seemed annoyed and lowered her eyes. At last, she said to her husband, "There's a man over there looking at me. I don't know him. Do you?" The husband, who had noticed nothing, glanced across at the offender and said, "No, not in the least." His wife continued, half smiling, half angry, "It's very tiresome. He quite spoils my ice cream." The husband shrugged his shoulders. "Nonsense. Don't take any notice of him. If we were to bother our heads about all the ill-mannered people, we should have no time for anything else." But the Vicomte abruptly left his seat. He could not allow this insolent fellow to spoil an ice for a guest of his. It was for him to take cognizance of the offence, since it was through him that his friends had come to the restaurant. He went across to the man and said, "Sir, you are staring at those ladies in a manner I cannot permit. I must ask you to desist from your rudeness." The other replied, "Let me alone, will you?" "Take care, sir," said the Vicomte between his teeth, "or you will force me to extreme measures." The man replied with a single word, a foul word, which could be heard from one end of the restaurant to the other, and which startled everyone there. All those whose backs were toward the two disputants turned round. All the others raised their heads. 3 waiters spun round on their heels like tops. The 2 lady cashiers jumped as if shot, then turned their bodies simultaneously like 2 automata worked by the same spring. There was dead silence. Then suddenly, a sharp, crisp sound. The Vicomte had slapped his adversary's face. Everyone rose to interfere. Cards were exchanged. When the Vicomte reached home, he walked rapidly up and down his room for some minutes. He was in a state of too great agitation to think connectedly. One idea alone possessed him, a duel. But this idea aroused in him as yet no emotion of any kind. He had done what he was bound to do. He had proved himself to be what he ought to be. He would be talked about, approved, congratulated. He repeated aloud, speaking as one does when under the stress of great mental disturbance, "What a brute of a man!" Then he sat down and began to reflect. He would have to find seconds as soon as morning came. Whom should he choose? He bethought himself of the most influential and best-known men of his acquaintance. His choice fell at last on the Marquis de la Tour Noire and Colonel Baudin, a nobleman and a soldier. That would be just the thing. Their names would carry weight in the newspapers. He was thirsty and drank 3 glasses of water, one after another. Then he walked up and down again. If he showed himself brave, determined, prepared to face a duel in deadly earnest, his adversary would probably draw back and proffer excuses. He picked up the card he had taken from his pocket and thrown on a table. He read it again, as he had already read it, first at a glance in the restaurant, and afterward on the way home in the light of each gas lamp. Georges Lamille, 51 Rue Moncey. That was all. He examined closely this collection of letters, which seemed to him mysterious, fraught with many meanings. Georges Lamille. Who was the man? What was his profession? Why had he stared so at the woman? Was it not monstrous that a stranger, an unknown, should thus all at once upset one's whole life, simply because it had pleased him to stare rudely at a woman? And the Vicomte once more repeated aloud, "What a brute!" Then he stood motionless, thinking, his eyes still fixed on the card. Anger rose in his heart against this scrap of paper, a resentful anger mingled with a strange sense of uneasiness. It was a stupid business altogether. He took up a penknife which lay open within reach and deliberately stuck it into the middle of the printed name, as if he were stabbing someone. So he would have to fight. Should he choose swords or pistols? For he considered himself as the insulted party. With the sword, he would risk less, but with the pistol, there was some chance of his adversary backing out. A duel with swords is rarely fatal, since mutual prudence prevents the combatants from fighting close enough to each other for a point to enter very deep. With pistols, he would seriously risk his life. But on the other hand, he might come out of the affair with flying colours and without a duel after all. "I must be firm," he said. "The fellow will be afraid." The sound of his own voice startled him, and he looked nervously round the room. He felt unstrung. He drank another glass of water and then began undressing, preparatory to going to bed. As soon as he was in bed, he blew out the light and shut his eyes. "I have all day tomorrow," he reflected, "for setting my affairs in order. I must sleep now in order to be calm when the time comes." He was very warm in bed, but he could not succeed in losing consciousness. He tossed and turned, remained for 5 minutes lying on his back, then changed to his left side, then rolled over to his right. He was thirsty again and rose to drink. Then a qualm seized him. Can it be possible that I am afraid? Why did his heart beat so uncontrollably at every well-known sound in his room? When the clock was about to strike, the prefatory grating of its spring made him start, and for several seconds he panted for breath, so unnerved was he. He began to reason with himself on the possibility of such a thing. Could I, by any chance, be afraid? No, indeed. He could not be afraid, since he was resolved to proceed to the last extremity, since he was irrevocably determined to fight without flinching. And yet, he was so perturbed in mind and body that he asked himself, is it possible to be afraid in spite of oneself? And this doubt, this fearful question, took possession of him. If an irresistible power, stronger than his own will, were to quell his courage, what would happen? He would certainly go to the place appointed. His will would force him that far. But supposing, when there, he were to tremble or faint? And he thought of his social standing, his reputation, his name. And he suddenly determined to get up and look at himself in the glass. He lighted his candle. When he saw his face reflected in the mirror, he scarcely recognized it. He seemed to see before him a man whom he did not know. His eyes looked disproportionately large, and he was very pale. He remained standing before the mirror. He put out his tongue as if to examine the state of his health, and all at once the thought flashed into his mind. At this time, the day after tomorrow, I may be dead. And his heart throbbed painfully. At this time, the day after tomorrow, I may be dead. This person in front of me, this, I whom I see in the glass, will perhaps be no more. What? Here I am, I look at myself. I feel myself to be alive. And yet in 24 hours I may be lying on that bed with closed eyes, dead, cold, inanimate. He turned round and could see himself distinctly lying on his back on the couch he had just quitted. He had the hollow face and the limp hands of death. Then he became afraid of his bed, and to avoid seeing it, went to his smoking room. He mechanically took a cigar, lighted it, and began walking back and forth. He was cold. He took a step toward the bell to wake his valet, but stopped with hand raised toward the bell rope. He would see that I am afraid. And instead of ringing, he made a fire himself. His hands quivered nervously as they touched various objects. His head grew dizzy, his thoughts confused, disjointed. painful. A numbness seized his spirit, as if he had been drinking, and all the time he kept on saying, "What shall I do? What will become of me?" His whole body trembled spasmodically. He rose and, going to the window, drew back the curtains. The day, a summer day, was breaking. The pink sky cast a glow on the city, its roofs and its walls. A flush of light enveloped the awakened world like a caress from the rising sun, and the glimmer of dawn kindled new hope in the breast of the Vicomte. What a fool he was to let himself succumb to fear before anything was decided, before his seconds had interviewed those of Georges Lamille, before he even knew whether he would have to fight or not. He bathed, dressed, and left the house with a firm step. He repeated as he went, "I must be firm, very firm. I must show that I am not afraid." His seconds, the Marquis and the Colonel, placed themselves at his disposal, and having shaken him warmly by the hand, began to discuss details. "You want a serious duel?" asked the Colonel. "Yes, quite serious," replied the Vicomte. "You insist on pistols?" put in the Marquis. "Yes. Do you leave all the other arrangements in our hands?" With a dry, jerky voice, the Vicomte answered, 20 paces, at a given signal, the arm to be raised, not lowered, shots to be exchanged until one or other is seriously wounded." "Excellent conditions," declared the Colonel in a satisfied tone. "You are a good shot. All the chances are in your favor." And they parted. The Vicomte returned home to wait for them. His agitation, only temporarily allayed, now increased momentarily. He felt, in arms, legs, and chest, a sort of trembling, a continuous vibration. He could not stay still, either sitting or standing. His mouth was parched, and he made every now and then a clicking movement of the tongue, as if to detach it from his palate. He attempted to take luncheon, but could not eat. Then it occurred to him to seek courage in drink, and he sent for a decanter of rum, of which he swallowed, one after another, 6 small glasses. A burning warmth, followed by a deadening of the mental faculties, ensued. He said to himself, "I know how to manage. Now it will be all right." But at the end of an hour he had emptied the decanter, and his agitation was worse than ever. A mad longing possessed him to throw himself on the ground, to bite, to scream. Night fell. A ring at the bell so unnerved him that he had not the strength to rise to receive his seconds. He dared not even to speak to them, wish them good day, utter a single word, lest his changed voice should betray him. "All is arranged as you wished," said the Colonel. "Your adversary claimed at first the privilege of the offended part, but he yielded almost at once, and accepted your conditions. His seconds are 2 military men." "Thank you," said the Vicomte. The Marquis added, "Please excuse us if we do not stay now, for we have a good deal to see to yet. We shall want a reliable doctor, since the duel is not to end until a serious wound has been inflicted, and you know that bullets are not to be trifled with. We must select a spot near some house to which the wounded party can be carried if necessary. In fact, the arrangements will take us another 2 or 3 hours at least." The Vicomte articulated for the second time, "Thank you." "You're all right?" asked the Colonel. "Quite calm?" "Perfectly calm, thank you." The 2 men withdrew. When he was once more alone, he felt as though he should go mad. His servant having lighted the lamps, he sat down at his table to write some letters. When he had traced at the top of a sheet of paper the words, "This is my last will and testament," he started from his seat, feeling himself incapable of connected thought, of decision in regard to anything. So he was going to fight. He could no longer avoid it. What, then, possessed him? He wished to fight. He was fully determined to fight, and yet, in spite of all his mental effort, in spite of the exertion of all his willpower, he felt that he could not even preserve the strength necessary to carry him through the ordeal. He tried to conjure up a picture of the duel, his own attitude, and that of his enemy. Every now and then his teeth chattered audibly. He thought he would read, and took down Chateauvillard's rules of dueling. Then he said, Is the other man practiced in the use of the pistol? Is he well known? How can I find out? He remembered Baron de Vaux's book on marksmen and searched it from end to end. Georges Lamille was not mentioned. And yet, if he were not an adept, would he have accepted without demur such a dangerous weapon and such deadly conditions? He opened a case of Gastine Renette, which stood on a small table, and took from it a pistol. Next, he stood in the correct attitude for firing and raised his arm. But he was trembling from head to foot, and the weapon shook in his grasp. Then he said to himself, "It is impossible. I cannot fight like this." He looked at the little black, death-spitting hole at the end of the pistol. He thought of dishonor, of the whispers at the clubs, the smiles in his friends' drawing rooms, the contempt of women, the veiled sneers of the newspapers, the insults that would be hurled at him by cowards. He still looked at the weapon, and raising the hammer, saw the glitter of the priming below it. The pistol had been left loaded by some chance, some oversight, and the discovery rejoiced him. He knew not why. If he did not maintain, in presence of his opponent, the steadfast bearing which was so necessary to his honor, he would be ruined forever. He would be branded, stigmatized as a coward, hounded out of society. And he knew that he could not maintain that calm, unmoved demeanor. And yet he was brave, since the thought that followed was not even rounded to a finish in his mind. But opening his mouth wide, he suddenly plunged the barrel of the pistol as far back as his throat and pressed the trigger. When the valet, alarmed at the report, rushed into the room, he found his master lying dead upon his back. A spurt of blood had splashed the white paper on the table and had made a great crimson stain beneath the words, "This is my last will and testament."
Clair de Lune, a short story by Guy de Maupassant. Abbé Marignan's martial name suited him well. He was a tall, thin priest, fanatic, excitable, yet upright. All his beliefs were fixed, never varying. He believed sincerely that he knew his God, understood his plans, desires, and intentions. When he walked with long strides along the garden walk of his little country parsonage, he would sometimes ask himself the question, "Why has God done this?" And he would dwell on this continually, putting himself in the place of God, and he almost invariably found an answer. He would never have cried out in an outburst of pious humility, "Thy ways, O Lord, are past finding out." He said to himself, "I am the servant of God. It is right for me to know the reason of his deeds, or to guess it if I do not know it." Everything in nature seemed to him to have been created in accordance with an admirable and absolute logic, the whys and becauses always balanced. Dawn was given to make our awakening pleasant, the days to ripen the harvest, the rains to moisten it, the evenings for preparation for slumber, and the dark nights for sleep. The 4 seasons corresponded perfectly to the needs of agriculture, and no suspicion had ever come to the priest of the fact that nature has no intentions, that on the contrary, everything which exists must conform to the hard demands of seasons, climates, and matter. But he hated woman, hated her unconsciously, and despised her by instinct. He often repeated the words of Christ, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" And he would add, "It seems as though God himself were dissatisfied with this work of his." She was the tempter who led the first man astray, and who since then had ever been busy with her work of damnation, the feeble creature, dangerous and mysteriously affecting one. And even more than their sinful bodies, he hated their loving hearts. He had often felt their tenderness directed toward himself, and though he knew that he was invulnerable, he grew angry at this need of love that is always vibrating in them. According to his belief, God had created woman for the sole purpose of tempting and testing man. One must not approach her without defensive precautions and fear of possible snares. She was, indeed, just like a snare, with her lips open and her arms stretched out to man. He had no indulgence except for nuns, whom their vows had rendered inoffensive, but he was stern with them nevertheless, because he felt that at the bottom of their fettered and humble hearts the everlasting tenderness was burning brightly, that tenderness which was shown even to him, a priest. He felt this cursed tenderness, even in their docility, in the low tones of their voices when speaking to him, in their lowered eyes, and in their resigned tears when he reproved them roughly. And he would shake his cassock on leaving the convent doors and walk off, lengthening his stride as though flying from danger. He had a niece who lived with her mother in a little house near him. He was bent upon making a sister of charity of her. She was a pretty, brainless madcap. When the abbé preached, she laughed, and when he was angry with her, she would give him a hug, drawing him to her heart, while he sought unconsciously to release himself from this embrace, which nevertheless filled him with a sweet pleasure, awakening in his depths the sensation of paternity which slumbers in every man. Often, when walking by her side along the country road, he would speak to her of God, of his God. She never listened to him, but looked about her at the sky, the grass and flowers, and one could see the joy of life sparkling in her eyes. Sometimes she would dart forward to catch some flying creature, crying out as she brought it back, "Look, uncle, how pretty it is! I want to hug it." And this desire to hug flies or lilac blossoms disquieted, angered, and roused the priest, who saw, even in this, the ineradicable tenderness that is always budding in women's hearts. Then there came a day when the sexton's wife, who kept house for Abbé Marignon, told him with caution that his niece had a lover. Almost suffocated by the fearful emotion this news roused in him, he stood there, his face covered with soap, for he was in the act of shaving. When he had sufficiently recovered to think and speak, he cried, "It is not true. You lie, Melanie." But the peasant woman put her hand on her heart, saying, "May our Lord judge me if I lie, Monsieur le Curé. I tell you, she goes there every night when your sister has gone to bed. They meet by the riverside. You have only to go there and see, between 10 o'clock and midnight." He ceased scraping his chin and began to walk up and down impetuously, as he always did when he was in deep thought. When he began shaving again, he cut himself 3 times from his nose to his ear. All day long he was silent, full of anger and indignation. To his priestly hatred of this invincible love was added the exasperation of her spiritual father, of her guardian and pastor, deceived and tricked by a child, and the selfish emotion shown by parents when their daughter announces that she has chosen a husband without them, and in spite of them. After dinner he tried to read a little, but could not, growing more and more angry. When 10 o'clock struck, he seized his cane, a formidable oak stick, which he was accustomed to carry in his nocturnal walks when visiting the sick, and he smiled at the enormous club, which he twirled in a threatening manner in his strong, country fist. Then he raised it suddenly, and gritting his teeth, brought it down on a chair, the broken back of which fell over on the floor. He opened the door to go out, but stopped on the sill, surprised by the splendid moonlight, of such brilliance as is seldom seen. And as he was gifted with an emotional nature, one such as had all those poetic dreamers, the fathers of the Church, he felt suddenly distracted and moved by all the grand and serene beauty of this pale night. In his little garden, all bathed in soft light, his fruit trees in a row cast on the ground the shadow of their slender branches, scarcely in full leaf, while the giant honeysuckle, clinging to the wall of his house, exhaled a delicious sweetness, filling the warm, moonlit atmosphere with a kind of perfumed soul. He began to take long breaths, drinking in the air as drunkards drink wine, and he walked along slowly, delighted, marveling, almost forgetting his niece. As soon as he was outside of the garden, he stopped to gaze upon the plain, all flooded with the caressing light, bathed in that tender, languishing charm of serene nights. At each moment was heard the short, metallic note of the cricket, and distant nightingales shook out their scattered notes, their light, vibrant music that sets one dreaming without thinking, a music made for kisses, for the seduction of moonlight. The abbé walked on again, his heart failing, though he knew not why. He seemed weakened, suddenly exhausted. He wanted to sit down, to rest there, to think, to admire God in his works. Down yonder, following the undulations of the little river, a great line of poplars wound in and out. A fine mist, a white haze through which the moonbeams passed, silvering it and making it gleam, hung around and above the mountains, covering all the tortuous course of the water with a kind of light and transparent cotton. The priest stopped once again, his soul filled with a growing and irresistible tenderness. And a doubt, a vague feeling of disquiet came over him. He was asking one of those questions that he sometimes put to himself. Why did God make this? Since the night is destined for sleep, unconsciousness, repose, forgetfulness of everything, why make it more charming than day, softer than dawn or evening? And does why this seductive planet, more poetic than the sun, that seems destined, so discreet is it, to illuminate things too delicate and mysterious for the light of day, make the darkness so transparent? Why does not the greatest of feathered songsters sleep like the others? Why does it pour forth its voice in the mysterious night? Why this half veil cast over the world? Why these tremblings of the heart, this emotion of the spirit, this enervation of the body? Why this display of enchantments that human beings do not see, since they are lying in their beds? For whom is destined this sublime spectacle, this abundance of poetry cast from heaven to earth? And the abbé could not understand. But see, out there, on the edge of the meadow, under the arch of trees bathed in a shining mist, two figures are walking side by side. The man was the taller, and held his arm about his sweetheart's neck and kissed her brow every little while. They imparted life all at once to the placid landscape in which they were framed as by a heavenly hand. The two seemed but a single being, the being for whom was destined this calm and silent night, and they came toward the priest as a living answer, the response his master sent to his questionings. He stood still, his heart beating, all upset, and it seemed to him that he saw before him some biblical scene, like the loves of Ruth and Boaz, the accomplishment of the will of the Lord, in some of those glorious stories of which the sacred books tell. The verses of the Song of Songs began to ring in his ears, the appeal of passion, all the poetry of this poem replete with tenderness. And he said unto himself, perhaps God has made such nights as these to idealize the love of men. He shrank back from this couple that still advanced with arms intertwined. Yet it was his niece. But he asked himself now if he would not be disobeying God. And does not God permit love, since he surrounds it with such visible splendor? And he went back musing, almost ashamed, as if he had intruded into a temple where he had no right to enter.